Now, while it is impossible to say exactly what caused the explosion this morning, no one can say what caused the explosion. And the National Aeronautics and Space Administration seems to be puzzled at this moment as to what could have caused it.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that
this is the slow motion, a slow motion replay of the accident. Watch this now. This is slow motion replay of the accident, indicates what happened. You can see a small explosion apparently on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters. Then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and the fireball that appears to consume the Challenger. Awful as it is, let us take this videotape, if you will, and control back to the beginning, because with what little we know about this story, it may be important that people understand what you can see and what you can't see. And we're going to show you in slow motion why it's now, as we take a close look at it, you can tell what happened. Now, this is normal motion. Now, close up, you see. Now, that's normal motion. Now, let's take slow motion coming back and watch the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And you'll see that the explosion apparently started on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, and then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and fireball that just obliterated the Challenger. Let's take it in slow motion here, if we may. Now, re-rack that to show the slow motion. While they're doing that, when we say the solid rocket boosters, we're talking about these are the solid rocket boosters. And now, when we see it in slow motion, we can clearly see the explosion happen on the right side, first on the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters, and then there was the major explosion. Now, let's take a look at the slow motion replay. See the Challenger riding as it's supposed to. Then that small explosion on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, followed by the greater and main explosion. All of this happening a minute and 12 seconds into this morning's launch. The 56 times NASA has put a man, at least one human, into space. Now, on the upper right-hand side, pardon me for interrupting, but you can now see this is terrifying and fascinating as you see the slow motion. Look at your picture, upper right-hand quadrant of the picture. You can see the long pencil-like extension away from the explosion, upper right-hand corner of your screen. That is one of the solid rocket boosters blown apart from the space shuttle, as the space shuttle, its main fuel tank, and the shuttle itself and the other solid rocket booster are completely obliterated. And you can see, emphasize again, that in the slow motion, that the first explosion occurred on the right-hand side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And as Bruce Hall said earlier, there was a hard freeze in Florida this morning, and one of the theories, underscore, italicize, all caps, one of the theories is that perhaps some icicles formed by the hard freeze coming off the Space Shuttle Challenger may have caused the explosion in one of these solid rocket boosters. Now, Bill Plante, our White House correspondent, is at the White House where Larry Speaks, President Reagan's principal spokesman, briefed earlier and very sadly a bit earlier on in the morning. Bill, do we know anything more at the White House? Do they know anything more now about what may have happened?
Dan, there's been nothing new that's come in here. They're still watching. They're still waiting, listening to NASA. There is, I understand, a direct link now between the White House and NASA. But as far as we know, they've been able to tell them nothing new. The president reacted with stunned silence, we're told, when he was informed about this by the vice president and the national security advisor. He was in the Oval Office when he heard the news. He stepped into the small room next to the Oval Office where there's a television set, and we're told then turned it on and looked at the video replays, which we have just seen. It's a very tough moment for this White House, perhaps the more so because of the message of hope and optimism that Mr. Reagan is planning to sound tonight at the State of the Union address. We are told, Dan, though, that the president will certainly mention something about this tonight in his State of the Union.
Bill, was consideration given to not having the State of the Union tonight, to postponing it?
Not as far as we know, Dan. That's one of the first questions that was asked of Larry Speaks, the president's spokesman, and he indicated that they hadn't talked about that yet or thought about it. We did see the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, at the time that this was all learned. There were a group of reporters in for a briefing about the State of the Union. We saw the National Security Advisor, Admiral Poindexter, get up and talk to an aide and walk out. And then a moment later, someone brought in a note to Regan, the Chief of Staff. He looked down, he read it, and said, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that the space shuttle has blown up." And that's about when the president learned. So they really have had very little chance to do anything but be shocked, as we all were.
Well, Bill, the State of the Union message is scheduled for 9 o'clock this evening Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time. There still is a chance, there still is time for them to change their mind about going ahead with it. But your emphasis for the moment is that you've been told that the president does intend to go ahead with the State of the Union tonight as scheduled.
That's right, Dan, as far as we know now.
Thank you, Bill. School teacher Chris McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, as we mentioned earlier, were at the Cape this morning at a VIP site about 3 miles from the actual launch. They were watching the launch. Here's what happened. Parents of schoolteacher McAuliffe as they watched the space shuttle launch this morning, a launch that began for them with great pride and joy and ended in tears. Before that awful moment, everything seemed fine as the astronauts ate breakfast before the launch.
Dan, this was the astronauts as they were having breakfast earlier this morning. It was a very happy group. They were very pleased to be going on this shuttle. Ellison Onizuka, and you saw Krista McAuliffe. And as they had breakfast, there was the traditional cake wishing them good luck. For identification purposes, you have Judy Resnick and Ron McNair there, and Greg Jarvis. They were all ready to go and anxious to go after several delays. And as they left the breakfast area and left the building where they had been spending the time, Krista McAuliffe said, "It's going to go today." Krista McAuliffe was looking forward to this flight. She was extremely anxious. She felt after several months of training now, she had become part of the team. She still considered herself a teacher rather than an astronaut, but she felt that she had become part of the team. The NASA now has some cameras that have reached the scene of the incident, and I don't know if you're able to see this in New York, Dan, but I can tell here we see several pieces of debris that are out into the ocean, which appear from every indication we have here to be maybe 3, 4, or 5 miles off the coast of Florida here at the Kennedy Space Center. It appears in looking at the screen that there are small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. This is a NASA plane that is flying over the impact area. According to the first reports from people on the scene, that it was just small pieces showered down for several seconds, and almost it seemed like several minutes. However, it is more likely that it was a few seconds. You can see in the center of your screen, as they zoom in, small pieces from the Space Shuttle Challenger. And these are the first scenes from the recovery operation. NASA has sent several paramedics into the area. The paramedics are now in the water, and they are looking for any evidence that they can find or the possibility of any survivors. These are the first pictures that we've been able to see from the recovery scene just a few miles off the Kennedy Space Center.